All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the College Transfer Portal Podcast, sponsored by NoContextCFB. Today we have a special guest with us. We have Josh Pate. He's at Late Kick Josh on Twitter. He's with 24/7 Sports, CBS Sports headquarters. He's the host of the Late Kick podcast. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm good, man. Headed to Columbus, Ohio this weekend. Hadn't been up there ever, actually. Have not been there, period. So looking forward to that. I got some consequential games, as they would say, coming up.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, I have our very loyal co-host, and he's been on quite a bit, Dylan. Dylan, good morning. How are you, sir?
Doing great. This is the earliest I've ever recorded a podcast. It's just after 8:15 my time, but I'm excited. I'm ready to go.
Great. Well, definitely. So we're about at the tail end of the college football season. I can't believe it's already winding down. At least the regular season. We have a couple of games left, a couple of big games left. So we're just going to dive right into it. Josh, so yesterday we obviously saw the college football rankings. What is your initial reaction to that? What do you think? Is anybody underrated, overrated? What is your initial reaction? There's a lot of controversy pretty much every week with those rankings, but what was your take on it after yesterday?
I didn't have a lot of controversy. I don't really have a lot of visceral reaction towards the playoff ranking, especially this deep into it. It's pretty predictable. If you wanted to tell me that you have a problem with Michigan being over Michigan State based on principle, I'd probably nod my head in agreement. I think in a power rating world, Ole Miss should be a lot higher than wherever they were. I think number 13 or something like that. I'm very curious about how much potential Notre Dame may still have. I think there's an assumption out there that Notre Dame's ceiling is Cincinnati being in front of them. Well, that assumption entails Cincinnati winning out. And I don't just take it for granted that Cincinnati is going to win out because they have not played dominant football down the stretch. So those are some of the main takeaways I had. I'm also curious, if this SEC scenario plays itself out where Bama and Georgia face off in Atlanta, if Bama were to win that game, I don't doubt Georgia would be in. I'm very curious about the seeding. And I would be very curious about that because obviously that determines whether those two immediately play again in the semis or potentially meet in the national championship game. And I know there are wildly varying schools of thought out there on that.
Josh, you talked about the Cincinnati Bearcats a little bit. Do you think that the College Football Playoff Committee will ever really take a group of 5 teams seriously? Because obviously Cincinnati is the first one out of the top 4. It took them a while to rank UTSA, who's just still barely in there. Houston wasn't ranked until this week. So do you think that they're not taking them seriously? What's your take on that?
No, I think they're taking them very seriously. That number 5 is being taken very seriously. I think it's taken a while to build up the collective equity, the G5 equity, if you will, to garner that kind of respect. But don't forget, and I think this will be forgotten down the road, don't forget when these first playoff rankings were released a few weeks ago, you had an undefeated Oklahoma out there ranked behind undefeated Cincinnati. So it wasn't just the blanket G5 versus Power 5 brand versus non-brand thing. That all got washed away with that one example. What I do think they're also taking into account, as they should, is the total lackluster strength of schedule, to which the common retort is, well, Cincinnati can't do anything about that. They're just playing the schedule that they're dealt. That's true. Georgia can't do anything about it either. It's not Oregon's fault. It's not Alabama's fault. I've always advocated for a G5 playoff because it removes a lot of the nonsense arguments that we have to have about this, but everyone always pushes back on that. So they want both worlds. They want to pretend, and that is exactly what we're doing, pretending that 130 teams are out here playing the same level of football, which they're not. And because we have to pretend that, we also have to pretend that schedule is equal, and we have to pretend that therefore record is equal, and you are what your record says you are, and a win is a win. And none of that is true in college football, but we still have to pretend. So I think they're taking Cincinnati very seriously. I think they're taking G5 teams more seriously than they ever have. The fact of the matter is, you should never take your average G5 conference as seriously as your average Power 5 conference because the strength of schedule disparity will always be there.
Yeah, definitely make a great point. And I think what Cincinnati's doing too, I think they're kind of coming up with a blueprint of how to get in that conversation. The conversation was always that they don't play anybody. We saw that with UCF a couple of years ago. Well, they didn't play anybody. And now I think we kind of see what Cincinnati's doing with, playing Notre Dame and playing Indiana and beating these teams on the road. So I think you kind of started to see that blueprint. Would you agree on that as well?
Well, yes, but where Cincinnati's dropped the ball is not in their hands at all. It's their conference that's dropped the ball this year. When we entered this season, I said for the first time ever, I thought a G5 team, if it went undefeated, and I was talking about Cincinnati, would be in the playoff. Number one, because I thought enough dominoes would fall around them. Still may. But number two, independent of that, I thought the scheduling up of the two Power Fives on the road was the first step they needed to take. And then the second step, I thought was going to be fulfilled by their conference. The AAC had, over the last couple of years, risen to offering the caliber of play right on par with what the lower level Power Five was offering. I think the AAC and the Pac-12, for example, have offered very comparable products over the last couple of years. And so I looked at it foolishly, as it turns out, and thought, if they go undefeated in that conference, which has more respect now than any G5 has ever had, and you combine that with those two road wins, if they got a perfect resume consisting of that, it'll be good enough. And here they are with a perfect resume consisting of that so far, and it may not be good enough because their conference has fumbled the ball mightily for them.
But not to get too deep in the conversation with Group of Five, because we definitely have a lot of more important issues to go through. But what about UT? So let's talk about UTSA a little bit. I live in San Antonio, so I've been paying attention to UTSA my entire since the start of their existence, and I've kind of seen that rise that they've gone through, right? And this season, it's kind of taken by storm. Everybody's kind of on board. They're kind of like that team you want to root for now because it's they avoid everything they're going through. What do you give? What is your take on UTSA? Is it just a cute little story? Is it something that they can continue building momentum? I know they're going to the AAC in a couple of years. What is your take on UTSA? Should they be higher in the rankings? Do you think they should get a little bit more respect on that?
My take on UTSA is to revert back to what we were talking about 5 minutes ago. If we lived in a world where things were, I would say, properly constructed, UTSA, not only would it be a great story, they'd have a shot at a championship. So my answer within our current context is UTSA is probably ranked where they should be. I think it's foolish that there would ever be a notion that an undefeated University of Texas San Antonio this late in the year should have an ounce of disappointment in their mood because they may not be able to compete in a tournament with Georgia and Ohio State. That should never be the status in this sport for a program of that caliber. UTSA should be in a situation right now where they are waking up every morning feeling like they're attending a parade because they're out of their mind excited about where their football program is relative to where it's been. They should be excited about the future, but also in the here and now, they should have a shot at a tournament that, number one, they have a legitimate shot at winning, and number two, consists of other teams with comparable resources to them. Instead, we're watching on Tuesday night and pretending that they exist in the same world as programs with 1,000 times the resources that they have. And instead of being celebratory, we have to sit around and ask, well, when are they ever going to get respect? Should they be ranked higher? It's just, I'm not calling you foolish. I'm saying that entire ecosystem. It's so foolish that that's the way things are constructed right now.
Very interesting.
With the environment of, the Group of Five versus the Power Five, kind of that, starts every Tuesday night with the college football playoff rankings. I know the ESPN guys were talking a bit about like a 2-loss Alabama team. If they were to lose, say, one more regular season game or to Georgia in the SEC championship game, would they have a shot to get in to the playoff over an undefeated Cincinnati or another 1-loss team? What's your take on that?
It was funny. I was watching that in our studio last night, right before we started our show. And I think it was Joey Galloway who made a point that perfectly separated the power rating philosophy from the merit-based philosophy. So what he said, and I don't think a lot of people caught it, what he said is, this doesn't make sense to me. So you're telling me Alabama's the number 2 team in the country. And if they play the number 1 team in the country and lose very narrowly, it bumps them out of the top 4. And, Reese Davis, the folks on the desk said, yeah, that's what we're saying. And Joey Galloway's retort was, but wouldn't the number 2 team losing close to the number 1 team just validate the fact that they are the number 2 team? And in a power rating world, yes. And if you're a Vegas odds maker, yes. So that's where the blend of power and merit comes in here when we talk about the question you just asked. If Alabama loses that game, are we power rating them? Because if so, they're not dropping from number 2. or are we ranking them? At which point it would be a second loss on their resume, and it is an entire game of comparison and resume building and whatnot. And at that point, yeah, they would probably drop out. I don't think it's a certainty that if Alabama loses close, they drop out. I think it's a probability or a likelihood that they do. But what I try not to do is make all these statements in a vacuum and speak in absolutes when these aren't happening. These games aren't happening in vacuums. These teams don't exist in vacuums. Alabama's status, if they lose to Georgia, is correlated to what Oregon does or what Cincinnati does, or, you know, what any number of these other teams do. What if the Big Ten doesn't even send a team? You know, what if they knock each other out and then Wisconsin pulls an upset in the Big Ten title game? Big 12 could do the same thing, cannibalize itself. So the point is, if chalk holds, then Alabama's out if they lose. But if chaos happens and you've got two certain teams and then there's just this cluster of 1 and 2 loss mess, Alabama could end up, when the dust settles, still being that number 4 team.
I think the comparison to your point as well, too. What happened in 2018 with Georgia? They lost to LSU on the road, and then they went into the SEC championship and lost a very close game to number 1 Alabama, and they didn't make they didn't put them in the Final Four. So they were the 2-loss team that didn't make the Final Four. I think that will be the comparison that they make. Now, obviously, we talk about Alabama, and first people want to kind of put Alabama's status is a little bit, in my opinion, at least, it gets a little bit of a bias sometimes. So I think that would compare the two. With a 2-loss Georgia team in 2018 who lost a very, very close game in the SEC title game to Alabama. They didn't get in. And then even the year after that, a 2-loss Georgia team, they lost to South Carolina at home, which was that justifies them not getting in. But they lost to LSU again in the SEC title game, a 2-loss Georgia team. And they were ranked, I think they ranked them number 5 at the end of that, at the final rankings as well. So I think that very compares the situation here. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's all about chaos. And so speaking of Georgia and Alabama, and you know, we've talked about all season. We've definitely talked about how Georgia has separated themselves. At least that's a conversation, that they've separated themselves, being the number 1 team in the country. They're the clear-cut number 1 team in the country. As a Georgia fan, I watch every single game every Saturday. I have a hard time. I don't know if it's just, you know, the trauma that I've experienced the last few years with Georgia football, just kind of getting so close but no cigar. But I don't really feel that right now. What do you believe, that it really is Georgia and then everybody else, or is there what's the gap between Georgia and the rest of the top 5 or top 4 right now?
3 points is probably the gap between Bama and Georgia right now, in reverse order. I think there is a gap between the team that is ranked number 1 and the rest of the field, because one of them is blemish-free, playing a major schedule, and the others aren't. But I think of gap different. So I was just raised and taught and kind of programmed to think in terms of odds making. And so in odds makers terms, the line's already out there. You don't have to guess on this. In the futures market, Georgia is about a 3-point favorite over Alabama right now. So when people ask me about gap, that's the gap. I talked to, I got a very prominent coach somewhere in the South that I speak to about this a lot, because I want to get his flowing opinion on it. And that's kind of the way it is there too. There are a lot of pluses and minuses, probably a lot of things that Georgia could be pressed by, that they have not faced adequate competition that has strength in that specific area to expose a potential weakness. Maybe Alabama has a little bit more of that. Look, the bottom line is, athletically, the first and only team Georgia will face all year, and that includes Clemson this year, the first and only team that Georgia will face all year that has the ability to stress them across the board is Alabama. Having said that, I think Georgia's the better team right now. Now, we've seen those two teams go at it several times over the last few years. Always been a tight game. Alabama's come out on top. I don't know if those fractions of inches, and I don't know if one or more first downs here or there are the difference this year. It's going to be a fun time as we talk. I mean, I've got our director of programming right now lining up our programming for that weekend. So we're 2 weeks away from that. And the fine folks here at CBS have already got one eye peeled 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the road to Atlanta, Georgia, because when those two brands meet, if you grew up in the South, you know this. I know it's not for a national championship, but the buildup in 2018, for example, the buildup to that SEC championship rematch was bigger than I covered both games. I went to the national title game that year. the build up to the SEC championship game was bigger than the build up to the national championship game. So it's a big tidal wave on the horizon.
And sticking with the SEC, around this time, we're entering week 12. We're starting the conversation with head coaching carousels and firings and all these rumors that have been flying around. And one of them that's, really caught traction the last couple of weeks is Dan Mullen in Florida, how they've kind of fallen off after, that really close loss to Alabama. People thought they were a little bit closer to, being a contender than they thought. And then it's just kind of fallen through. And then the Samford game. So, how hot is Dan Mullen's seat right now at Florida, and what's kind of the end game there for him?
I think he's going to lose his job after this season. So that's my opinion on things. It concerns me that there may be folks in the decision-making position or positions at Florida who maybe aren't convinced and want to let the rest of the season determine Dan Mullen's fate. To me, it is very misguided to think that way, especially when you've got a 4-year sample size on a guy. To me, if you have observed someone for 4 years, there is nothing that 4 or 8 quarters more of football should be able to tell you that you already don't know. And I say that not knowing for sure that that's the situation. I say it hoping that's not the situation. To me, the mountain that Dan Mullen would have to climb in order to get this program back to national relevancy and get it above and beyond even the best that it had been under him is something that's insurmountable. From a recruiting to staffing issue, it's too much to me for him to overcome. I'm not saying he couldn't be given another year and win 8 games. I do not believe if given another year or 10 years, he's going to have them remotely in the conversation for national championship. And that should be the standard down there. So I think they will move on from him. I don't think the University of Florida should ever bat an eye at how competitive the job market is going to be. I think other programs should be scared of the Florida job coming open. That's the way I think they should look at it. I'm not sure they do, but I think that's the way they should look at it.
And who do you think, if that were to be the case, where do you think they go? Where does Florida goes from here? Like, is there somebody that should be a number one on the radar? Specifically for, I don't think Florida's going to want to rebuild. I think they're going to want to find somebody that's going to go in there and try to bring it back to relevancy fairly quickly, kind of what Kirby Smart did with Georgia or Nick Saban did with Alabama. Is there somebody out there that you think that could potentially be in that conversation?
I know that there's a way that Florida likes to win, and there's a way historically they have won. They did it with Spurrier, they did it with Urban Meyer, and they did not do it with guys like Jim McElwain, for example. So there's a style that may be a little different than it is at Alabama or Georgia. There's a style of football they want to play as they win. It is a Lane Kiffin style of football. But as soon as you mention Lane Kiffin's name, you get an immediate reaction. It's one way or the other. Either I love him or no, never. And there's probably both of those in the 4 walls of the Florida Athletic Building. And so if that job were to come open, Lane Kiffin fits the model, the mold for what they would look for. I don't know how crazy they would be about the profile of hiring Lane Kiffin. Maybe they'd be all on board. Maybe they arrive at the conclusion that whatever, let's just roll the dice. Let's do it. The guy I love is Dave Aranda. I don't know that Dave Aranda would be a fit there. I don't know that he'd have interest there, but I am very, very enamored with Dave Aranda. So if I had a job opening anywhere, that's the guy I'd be targeting.
Well, yeah, that is very interesting. As a Georgia fan, I don't want to see Dan Mullen leave because I like beating him up every year. So I would not like to see that. But another kind of random hiring we saw is Jim Mora to UConn. What is your take on that? It kind of, I don't know, it just seemed kind of out of left field for that. I'm not the biggest fan of that hiring. What do you think? And what do you think that domino effect is going to take place at, coming into the offseason?
Run that one by me again. It skipped.
I'm sorry. With Jim Mora going to UConn, it could just kind of seem very random a little bit. And what do you think the domino effect of that hiring will be, moving forward as these jobs start opening up with the caliber of hirings that will be made?
I don't think it has a domino effect at all. That's a guy who's probably just tired of sitting in a TV studio. It's a guy who wanted any potential job. It would not have surprised me if Jim Mora took a really, really high profile, like high school head coaching job, like down in Texas. It would not have surprised me if that happened. Some would argue he did the equivalent of that on the college level, but that's a guy who, those options are there for a number of guys who are currently holding down roles in studios. I mean, Chip Kelly did TV. Chip Kelly probably got 100 offers while he was doing TV. He finally took one of them. Jim Mora just took the first one, apparently, that came along, and that's his prerogative. That's fine. I don't think it has a domino effect at all, though.
Okay, interesting.
We were talking about Dan Mullen in the hot seat, and it's kind of the hot conversation of college football throughout the season. So as of right now, maybe Dan Mullen might be the answer, but other than him, who do you think has the hottest seat, particularly of Power 5 teams?
Yeah, I think it's Dan Mullen. I think Manny Diaz at Miami fits this description very well as well. And so that becomes a huge story if one or both of those jobs open. And I think there's a greater than 50% chance that they both open. Then that becomes huge. It becomes huge from Florida State because they need to pounce while they can. And then also anytime those jobs are open, it's a huge story in college football. And it could just be, think about how wild this entire coaching carousel circuit becomes when you got two of the big three open in Florida, or even one, plus the likes of Texas Tech and TCU and LSU and USC and who knows what else happens. So that's that is that's a year that you look back on a decade from now, and you look at which hires were made and then the trajectory of those programs, and then you get to ask yourself, with the benefit of hindsight, which programs should have just stood pat and sucked it up for one more year. It's nothing you can know. I mean, you can only make the best decision you can with the information you have now. But I know good and well in Knoxville, Tennessee, they moved on from Phil Fulmer. And I agreed. When they fired Phil Fulmer, I thought that, the program had gotten stale, it had run its course. But here's the problem. They never found the replacement. They probably did with Lane Kiffin, but Lane Kiffin moved on. And who's to say they wouldn't have racked up 100 violations per month if he stayed there with the way he was going at the time. But after that, it was a decade of wilderness. And the sad reality is common sense tells us one or two of these major programs are about to enter a decade of wilderness because they're going to make the wrong hire. We just don't know which one it is.
Yeah, wow. That's that's a very crazy way to look at it too. Like you mentioned, how is it going to look like in 10 years? Speaking of 10 years from now, what do you see the college football playoff looking like, moving forward? Do you think it's going to expand to 8, 12, 24? What do you see the end game is with the college football playoff?
I don't think there is an end game. I think once you've opened that can of worms, it just continues to spill out. I think probably if we're calling it 10 years from now, certainly we have an expanded model of some kind. But then also we don't know how that coincides with the overall conference structure that's out there. If you were to forecast 10 years from now, you'd ask a question like, okay, does every Power 5 conference champ have a seat at the table? Or how many Power 5 teams from the same conference are we allowing in? Not realizing that the phrase Power 5 may be totally outdated by then, or the concept of that many Power 5 caliber conferences may be totally outdated by then. So I don't think there's any way to forecast it. I don't think if you were to have all the decision makers right here with their own little box with us, I don't think they could forecast it. I think a lot of them would do what I just did. They would shrug and they'd be honest. There would be honest shrugs and they'd say, we kind of know the direction we're going. Like if I'm in Nashville right now and you told me drive to Seattle, Washington, I would start driving in the general northwest direction. Okay, so I know the direction I'm going. But when you nail down the specific route I have to take, and the closer you get, the specific roads that you have to get off on and which exit here and there, I have no clue.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to look at it. So we have no idea what's going to happen moving forward with the college football playoffs. So these next couple questions are kind of more, just quick questions about your experience with college football. And then we'll get you out of here. I know we're getting close to the time you got to go. So just a couple questions for me. What is the best college football game you've ever been to?
Regular season, it was probably Oklahoma, Texas this year. And that one was, I probably have some recency bias about, but that was amazing. In terms of postseason, I would say that 2017 Bama Georgia National Championship game, because I'm on the field right in front of Devontae Smith as he catches that ball. I actually had my phone out and I jumped in the dog pile with the Alabama players, just filming, just not remotely where I'm supposed to be. But I remember thinking in the moment, and the several moments after that, you just experienced history. They'll show a replay of that as long as this sport exists. And you grew up an hour down the road, dreamed of covering the sport your entire life. And somehow, out of all the other people who could describe themselves that way, you're standing right here as that's going on. And then the very next year was covering the SEC title game when Jalen Hurts, who was benched in the 2017 game, comes off the bench to lead that same Alabama team past that same Georgia team. And so that was incredible. I was down in Tampa a couple of years earlier where Clemson beats Alabama on the last second. There's a lot of Alabama here because they're in all the big games we go to at the end of the year. But I tell you, we've seen some good stuff this year too. I was up in East Lansing for Michigan State a couple of weeks ago. Huge comeback win for Michigan State. Got to go to Penn State earlier this year, and Auburn goes in there, whiteout. It's early in the season, so Penn State's still undefeated, all the world in front of them. So there have been several memorable games this year, but also over the last 7-8 years that I've been able to do this that I could probably write a book about.
That's the beauty of college football, is that you always have any given Saturday, you kind of have a sense that some chaos can happen, and you don't really get that sense in the NFL. At least it's a lot more methodical, that thing in the NFL. But anyway, so that my second question was going to be, what's the best game you went to this year? So you kind of answered that question for me. So, but yeah, that's kind of good for me. Dylan, you got any questions for Josh?
Yeah, so I'm a University of Oregon alum. I used to go to all the games when I was a student, and just every time I would come home, my ears would just be ringing from how loud it was. Is there a stadium that is your favorite in college football that just leaves your ears ringing the most? Like, what's the loudest and just rowdiest crowd that you've experienced?
So when Alabama goes into LSU, that Tiger Stadium, and also being at Auburn when Georgia or Alabama come in there late in the year. I don't know that I've been in an environment that I think is more hostile to the road team than Jordan-Hare Stadium, where Auburn plays, when either Georgia or Alabama come in. And I've covered a lot of games there. Grew up 45 minutes away from Auburn. So I've covered a lot of games there. And it's always a really good environment. I don't think it's one that's mentioned when people are talking nationally about the most hostile environments, but it should be, because that is an extremely tough place to go into, so much so that from an odds-making perspective, I assignate a different total for a home field advantage for Auburn in those two specific games. I earmark them, I manually adjust them because I've seen it. I experience it. Here's what else is cool about this. This is why I love home field for college so much. It's true, like it's a legitimate home field. And so at Auburn, they have, and this is not the only place that does this, but at Auburn, they have the tunnel for the visitor is single file. You can only fit one player through there at a time. And it's very subtle, but it's an advantage because it takes that much longer to get up your tunnel to your locker room, which gives you just that much less time to be together at halftime to make an adjustment or two. Here's the second thing. If you're around the big programs, the Ohio States, the Clemsons, Bamas, their traveling party these days is so massive. It's multiple tractor trailers, buses, et cetera. And it's a lot of training, nutrition, and they can't fit it in the visitors' locker room. So if you go up the tunnel, which the public doesn't get to see, but if you go up the tunnel and you look, it's totally spilled out of the locker room. It's like all in the concourse and underneath the bleachers and stuff. And it's crazy to see because it looks like a makeshift operation in the middle of some war zone, but it's not. It's a college football stadium. It just so happens that it's way too big to fit in these little bitty locker rooms. Meanwhile, you go over to the home team and it's so palatial. Everything's brand new because they update stuff every 2 or 3 years. I love that though, because it is a legitimate challenge to go on the road in this sport.
Hopefully we don't have any reps from other schools paying attention and try to steal that strategy, because that's I never knew that. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
And we've talked so much with the transfer portal about the worst venues and kind of the ones to avoid. So in your experience, you've been to a lot of college football games. What is the worst venue that you've ever attended?
The worst venue to me was not the worst venue because of its quality. I just can't stand putting championship games in places like Santa Clara, California. Like we were out there for the title game a couple of years ago. And it's a new stadium. Levi Stadium is a new stadium, or new-ish. So it wasn't that the venue itself was subpar. It's just that no one cared relative to putting the game in New Orleans or Dallas or Atlanta or whatever the case may be. when you experience what we get to experience on the road every Saturday, going to true college venues, it is so anticlimactic to end the season in Santa Clara, in this big NFL building. It's this amorphous kind of blob of corporate banners all over the place. It just pales in comparison to the venues you play in to get to that point. So to me, I got a different answer than most people would. To me, it's not some dumpy college stadium. I love those. To me, the worst venues are the ones where they only play one college football game a year.
Yeah, wow, that's a very interesting answer, and I never really thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. That's very insightful on that. So, well, Josh, thank you so much for joining us. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I really do appreciate all your insight and your time with us here. You were amazing. I'm definitely one of your biggest fans. I know Dylan and all of us here at the Transfer Portal, follow your stuff and really love your insight. So we definitely appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us, and you have a great rest of your day. And I hope the rest of the college football season is just as crazy as the first 10, 11 weeks have been as well.
Absolutely. I'll endorse that. Appreciate you having me, guys.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.